Hello and welcome to Newsclick. Recently, Professor M. Kalburgi, former Vice-Chancellor of Hampi University, a rationalist and a Sahitya Academy Award winner, was shot point blank at his house by unknown assailants. To discuss this issue with us today, we have Dr. D. Raghunandan, former President of All India People Science Network. Welcome to Newsclick, Raghu. Raghu, this comes as quite a shock. Two unknown assailants came knocking at his door, Professor M. Kalburgi's door, and called him outside and shot him point blank. Why do you think this attack on such a reputed scientist like Mr. Kalburgi happened?
Well, of course, the police are conducting their inquiries, so one cannot go too far in speculation. However, the modus operandi is eerily similar to what happened with Dabholkar.
Absolutely.
And then what happened with Comrade Pansare. Very similar modus operandi in both cases. And just like in those two cases, here also Professor Kalburgi has had a long history of antagonism by right-wing Hindutva groups in Karnataka, as well as from conservative elements within his own Lingayat community, because of the iconoclastic views that Professor Kalburgi expressed. So it looks as if, unless there are new facts that come to light, it looks as if this is going to be one more in the series of attacks one has seen from far-right Hindutva extremist groups on figures who espouse rationalist views, who are academics and scholars, and who espouse views which the Hindu right does not like.
So what you're technically saying is that, the attacks are not just limited to people who question the Brahminical Hindutva narrative, but also people who essentially are working towards promoting a scientific temper in society. Professor Dabholkar, for example, was a rationalist and was leading a rationalist movement in Maharashtra, and also Professor M. Kalburgi and Comrade Govind Pansare. Now, I think what's common in all these murders is that somehow they challenge the dominant narrative of the current government. Where do you see this going? And I think one of the bigger concerns now is that this kind of a rationalist movement, where do you see that going in this country? Because on the one hand, now you have a prime minister who, at the inauguration of a private hospital of an industrialist, Ambani's hospital, at the inauguration of that hospital, he went to inaugurate. He made a speech saying stuff as absurd as how India had plastic surgery way back, and even Ganesh's head was transplanted through a plastic surgery and so on. So,
see, I'll put it like this. I think these are not just attacks on rationalism, and they are not just attacks on a contrarian view of religion. They are fundamentally attacks against anyone who espouses a viewpoint which these extremist forces do not like. It could be anything. It could be a commentary on religion, it could be a commentary on mythology, it could be a commentary on contemporary culture. If you're a young boy and a young girl going together, they also attract the ire of the senas who go and pull them out of buses and beat them up. So it's the closest thing we have in this country to the Taliban.
right.
If we want to look at parallels, this is what it is. There is some monolithic view which is not reflected in the religious texts, which orthodox scholars will say is not what Islam is to the Taliban, or not what the Hindu texts would say here either. It's an odd mixture of a supposedly religious viewpoint. It's political religion, if you like, and a political cultural standpoint. But I think the most important part of it is a method of saying, if we don't like what you say, we will compel you to withdraw and to subordinate yourself to our dominant viewpoint. So the culture is a culture of intimidation, of threat, and in extreme cases of assassination.
Maybe I'm sort of pushing my optimism here, but say for example, there was a similar attack on my film, which was being screened recently at Delhi University. But what we saw once news of that disruption spread, what we saw was that people held nationwide protest screenings against the disruption. So do you see this kind of a strong reaction amongst the scientific community, the rationalist organizations in the country?
The scientific community has already shown signs of rebellion. However, since a large section of the scientific community work in universities, research institutions, which are dependent on governmental support, their opposition to this would not be particularly vocal. We would really be looking forward to see opposition coming out on the streets in opposition to this. And I think there it is important not to get into the specifics of the particular dispute involved, whether it is what was the origin of the Lingayat community, or who said what where, and which century exactly did plastic surgery. I think these are not the important issues. The question is, if you hold an opinion different from B, if A holds a different opinion from B, what is B's response to that? B's response can certainly not be, I will catch hold of your collar, I will start yelling at you.
So a larger culture of tolerance.
It's a larger culture of tolerance. It's a culture of allowing pluralism in society. So the attack, as much as an attack on rationalism or scientific temper, is an attack on democracy per se, number one. And number two, it's an attack on critical thinking.
So essentially, I mean, when we have a force, and we have forces in power today that, like you said, are trying to propagate a kind of a monolithic understanding of religion, of culture, of how to live, then clearly there is very little tolerance for differing views. What we've also been seeing is that there has been this desperate attempt by this government to also, I mean, on the one hand, of course, there are assassinations, there are physical attacks, and there's all of that, and there's maligning on the social media and so on and so forth. But at the same time, or also using the police, say in the case of FTI students who've gone on strike. But what we're also seeing is this kind of indirect attack on educational institutions, right? And especially, let's say, IIT Delhi. And how do you see this? And a lot of premier science institutes like IIT and so on are also seeing a very strange kind of intervention by this government. Can you talk about that briefly?
We must make a distinction between what the government does as government and what these forces outside the government do.
Stormtroopers and the others.
Yeah. There's a lot of the terminology that one comes across these days is the fringe elements. I'm not at all sure these are fringe elements. They are as much part of, except that you get, shall we say, a range of how extreme you are. If you are less extreme, you will confine yourself to yelling at the other person. If you are a little more extreme, you will come to a little quasi-physical intimidation. If you are more extreme, it will be actual physical intimidation, physical assault, and in the final analysis it will be outright murder and assassination. I think the strangeness that you refer to is there is clearly going to be a contradiction at some point where a government which claims it wants an 8 to 10% economic growth, it wants an affiliation with the leading economies of the world, it wants investment and foreign investment and tourism and so on. In the long run, this cannot go hand in hand with a backward looking revanchist culture where you attack boys and girls or men and women on the streets and adopt a Taliban-like attitude. These things will not go hand in hand. You don't see any examples of an Islamist extremist movement simultaneously doing a modernization and economic advancement drive, because these two things cannot go hand in hand. The problem this government is going to face sooner or later is this contradiction. They seem to be hoping right now that a sufficient chunk of the middle classes can be bought over by economic prosperity and will ignore these other side effects. The big question is, can economic prosperity really take place under these circumstances, and how far will the people of this country tolerate this degree of suppression of pluralism and of a freedom to voice one's own opinion for a few pennies?
I think, Raghu, what we're essentially saying is that somewhere this culture of intolerance, this kind of monolithic culture that they're trying to force on the people of India, is not something that will sit well with essentially with the kind of pluralistic, heterogeneous society that we've been used to being for so many centuries.
And I think what is important is, political commentators have believed that the victory of the Narendra Modi government represents an aspirational desire of the Indian middle classes. This aspirational desire does not square with either this backward-looking revanchism or with a total lack of freedom and a lack of freedom to question and express your own opinion. I think, therefore, that a large part of the struggle, as I was saying earlier, is not to do with the specifics of religion, of rationality versus superstition, but to do with intolerance, the necessity to propagate a pluralistic culture and to resist efforts at denying this pluralism to the vast sections of our population and to impose an intolerant society in our country. I think that should be the main direction in which we go.